Goeiedag, good day, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world. And you know who the elephant in the room is right now? It's the expropriation of land without compensation. A presidential panel tasked with investigating land reform has given the go-ahead for a constitutional amendment for the expropriation of land without compensation, but with strict conditions. Now, just a bit of the background to this whole thing. They're now changing the constitution that was agreed on when the ANC took over government in 1994. And the victims in this compromise, I guess you could call it, are mainly the white population, who has clearly been targeted by people like the ANC. The report, compiled by a multidisciplinary advisory team on land reform and agriculture, was appointed by President Cyril Ramaphosa last year and was released on Sunday. This is after the bill got approval to proceed last week. The panel was appointed at the height of the land debate, when there were jitters about the damage such an amendment would do to property rights and investor certainty. Well, I'm just watching the Rand live, and it's not looking good. It's on its way to 15 Rand to the dollar, and I don't think it's going to stop there. Headed by economist and National Planning Commission member Vuyo Malati, the panel includes experts from across the spectrum. Two members aligned with the farming sector have distanced themselves from the report. In its report, the panel notes that even without a constitutional amendment, the state is able to expropriate for land reform purposes based on just and equitable compensation. There lies the rub. Just and equitable compensation. Now, without compensation. That's a huge differential, especially when you take farmlands where there are huge bank loans against the land, and that land is just suddenly expropriated. You know the really big loser is going to be? The banking system, because they'll be stuck losing that debt. And they can go after the farmer, and the farmer can just claim bankruptcy, and good luck with that bank. It says if the intention of the proposed amendment is to move away from mandatory compensation, then it should insert a new clause in Section 25 of the Constitution, which would read, Parliament must enact a legislation determining instances that warrant expropriation without compensation for purposes of land reform envisaged in Section 25(8). But the panel warns that if the intention of an amendment is to implement expropriation without compensation and without conditions, it would offend and collapse the underlying values of the Constitution. The report made wide-ranging proposals on how South Africa deals with land reform, ownership patterns, and food security. Other recommendations include a number of policy reforms to ensure that land is in the hands of those who need it most. On Thursday, the National Assembly resuscitated the work of the last Parliament when it established a multi-party ad hoc committee to introduce legislation to amend the Constitution. The committee will now have to take the report's recommendations into account. Well, we know the EFF have already said that they're not going to compromise at all. The report calls on Parliament to consider the latest version of the expropriation bill, which lists specified instances in which expropriation without compensation may take place. According to the bill, it may be just and equitable for nil compensation to be paid when land is expropriated in the public interest. Now, what a nebulous term is that? These instances include when land is occupied or used by a labour tenant. Every farm in South Africa has got labour tenants. So that opens up every farm in South Africa. Where land is held for speculative purposes. Okay, that's kind of different. Where land is state-owned or owned by a state-owned entity, that's different. Where the owner has abandoned the land, and where the market value of the land is equivalent to or less than the present value of direct state investment or subsidy in the acquisition and beneficial capital improvement of the land. The first one is a killer. That just opens up the whole farming sector. It recommends the Expropriation Bill plus its regulations be referred to the Constitutional Court for confirmation that they are consistent with the Constitution. The panel is scathing about the Office of the Valuer General, or OVG, calling for its function to be reviewed. The approach from the OVG has been to narrowly determine value in terms of market value alone. This defeats the very purpose for which the OVG was established, and it has not made a positive contribution towards effecting affordable land reforms, the report read. We recommend that the role and function of the OVG be reviewed to be in line with the Act to ensure that the compensation determined in the event of expropriation for land reform purposes is just and equitable and not purely market-based. One of the big bones of contention in the land debate has been around communal land, particularly land held by chiefs in rural areas. The panel warns against giving title to people who live on communal land. Rather, the panel recommends a land records bill to enable the majority of citizens who hold property off register to record and register their property, including residents of informal settlements, farm dwellers, and labour tenants. On foreign ownership, the panel throws its weight behind the recommendations of a 2006 expert report which call for a land ownership audit. In addition, the panel highlights the need to protect key and strategic land from foreign ownership. Well, the Chinese are already in there, guys, and they are taking a lot of your strategic land. And welcome to your new colonial masters, China. With regards to the proposed tax inquiry, the report says reform in this area must be premised on the recognition that land must serve a social function that is of the public benefit. An issue which is likely to be resisted by elements of the commercial farming community is the panel's call to Ramaphosa to publicly demand a halt to farm evictions and for him to expedite mechanisms for ensuring farm dwellers' land security. How the President's panel suggests the issue should be tackled. Financing land reform. A land reform fund, which would be a partnership between the government and the private sector, has been suggested as a tool to help bring about the release of much needed land. Outside of the limited land that can be acquired through expropriation without compensation, the President's advisory panel believes that the government needs to be proactive in finding other means of making a land available. And the panel says that outside of expropriation, government needs to explore acquiring land through open market purchases. The joint venture financing models would rely heavily on major players in the sector, including agribusiness, large commercial farmers, property developers, and commercial banks, for their implementation. The report notes a commitment by some commercial banks to match the state's budget for land reform in the interest of fast-tracking the progress in the form of a loan at a preferential rate over the set period. In establishing the need for new financing mechanisms, the panels referred to a 2016 study that highlighted that the budget for rural development and land reform has been consistently below 1% of the total budget, except for 2 years, 2006 and 2007. For redistribution referred to as land reform and the total budget, it is generally between 0.15% and 0.4%, reaching a peak of 0.44% of the national expenditure in 2008 and 2009, and then declining to 0.2% in the current financial year, the panel found. The panel is also hoping that the government can appeal to the consciences of organizations and individuals so they volunteer land donations through a policy that would be developed as part of the new white paper. This should specify the exemptions from donations tax of any land donated to land reform, and once appropriate beneficiaries are identified, the state should carry the conveyancing costs of land transfer, the report states. To expedite large donations from big institutional owners, we propose that the President call on churches, mining companies, financial institutions, agribusinesses, and others to audit their own land holdings and identify their size, location, and land use, as well as any long-term occupation on these lands. Following this, we call on the Minister to convene, within the coming year, talks across these sectors to identify land to be donated and to open discussions with potential beneficiaries, including existing land occupiers. Beneficiary selection. Now this is an interesting one, seeing that the pollies will be all over this. They will be wanting to maximize their own personal benefit. Farm dwellers, labour tenants and subsistence farmers have been identified as priorities in government plans to fast-track land reform. Yeah, let's watch this space. Believe me, it's not going to happen that way. The President's Advisory Panel has highlighted the need for those who are most vulnerable to be given priority by way of beneficiary selection. Good luck with that. Since the abandonment of land purchase grants and subsidies in 2011, there's been no system for rationing state funds, which opens opportunities for corruption, the report states, and that has been absolutely feral under this ANC government. Beneficiary selection has not been transparent, and there is evidence of so-called elite capture as business people of those with personal political connections acquire land ahead of farmers from communal areas or farm dwellers who have experience. Well, guess what? Nothing's going to change. A tiger doesn't change its spots. The panel has recommended that the majority of the budget for land reform give priority to farm dwellers, labour tenants, subsistence farmers, and smallholder farmers who produce goods for local market. The remainder of the budget should then be directed towards bigger players in the agricultural sector who are able to use their capital to leverage finance from the land bank and other lending institutions. This is headed for a huge fall, I can tell you now. Foreign-owned land. The panel has also recommended that the government further investigate the status of all types of land owned by foreigners in the country, while reiterating the need for strategic land to be protected and not sold to foreigners. So what about all this land that's been given to the Chinese? Well, they are honorary blacks, so I guess it doesn't matter, you know. Part of the system. Rehashing the findings of a panel of experts regarding foreign land ownership in the country, the panel found that the work done previously was in line with its own recommendations to the President. The panel of experts in 2004 had found that 3% of land and an even higher percentage of prime land, including coastal areas and game farm areas, was owned by foreigners. This was according to information available at the time, with the disclaimer that the actual figure could be much higher. The panel of experts had emphasized the need for the government to determine the exact amount of land owned by foreigners and what that land was used for. There was also a recommendation that policy be introduced that would compel the disclosure of information related to land owned by trusts and corporations that was not available to the public, to establish exactly who owned the land. Parliament was also tasked with presiding over the process of amending legislation that would ensure a record of the identity of landowners and a verification system, as well as the monitoring of landowners. There were also calls for a permanent interministerial committee consisting of the Department of Agriculture, Land Affairs, Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, as well as human settlements, which would monitor trends in foreign land ownership and changes in land use. In conclusion, the President's panel provides a whole endorsement of the work of the 2004 panel, urging government to tighten up policy to regulate the sale of land to those living outside the country. So there you go. expropriation of land without compensation. And apparently it's going to have a few little blockers on it, but I think it's going to totally screw the South African economy. And as I watch now, I see the rand heading up to 14.3 to the dollar. And just 2 days ago, it was under 14. And I think it's going to keep on going north, guys. I'm sorry about that, but I think that's where it's going. All right, please remember to subscribe to be kept informed. Ring the bell for updates, and have a great day.